Imagine a celestial object silently drifting through space, yet behaving in ways that no comet, asteroid, or natural phenomenon should. An object that defies physics, geometry, and every expectation we have about the cosmos. This is 3IATLAS, and what makes it truly remarkable is not just what it is, but who knew about it first. While the world looked to NASA for answers, the Air Force was already tracking it, recording, analyzing, and documenting data that would challenge everything we believe about space exploration. And until now, this information remained hidden from the public eye. Leaked documents and confidential logs reveal that military pilots observed something extraordinary, something impossible. Radar tracks, cockpit audio, and sensor data show abrupt directional changes, sudden accelerations, and maneuvers that no natural object could perform. Yet, hours after these observations, much of the data was classified, redacted, or simply erased. You might be wondering, why would the Air Force know something that NASA apparently didn't? Why is there a gap between what the military observed and what was released to the public? Could it be that the object is more than just a celestial visitor? In the next few minutes, we're going to dive deep into the evidence, exploring leaked logs, pilot testimonies, and radar files that suggest a reality far stranger than anything mainstream science is willing to acknowledge. And if the data is accurate, 3I Atlas isn't just a cosmic anomaly, it may be a message, a technology, or a sign that we are not alone. Before we go any further, consider this. For decades, humanity has gazed at the stars, assuming we are the only intelligent observers in the universe. But every now and then, events occur that shake this assumption to its core. 3.1 ATLAS is one of those events. And the fact that the Air Force was aware of it before NASA adds an unsettling layer to the mystery one that demands closer examination. Today, you'll hear evidence that was meant to remain classified. You'll see radar signatures, hear cockpit conversations, and learn about the timeline of events that few have ever been allowed to witness. And by the end of this video, one question will remain in your mind. What exactly is 3I Atlas, and why was it being watched so closely by the most powerful military force on Earth before NASA even acknowledged its existence? Stay with me, because the answers, or at least the clues, are far stranger than you could imagine. When 3I Atlas first appeared on long-range sensors, the public was told it was nothing more than a faint, distant anomaly too small to classify. Too fast to study, too unusual to understand. NASA referred to it as an unconfirmed detection, and the agency's initial public report was barely 3 sentences long. But what the public didn't know, what no one outside certain military circles was meant to know, is that the U.S. Air Force had already been tracking the object for nearly 6 hours before NASA even acknowledged its existence. And the story of how that happened, how one branch of the government knew what the other didn't, or wouldn't, begins with a single encrypted transmission recorded at 2:14 Eastern Time. It came from an early warning radar site normally responsible for monitoring classified aerospace activity. But that night, its operators saw something that didn't match any known aircraft, missile trajectory, or orbital debris. What they saw behaved in ways that, at the time, they could only describe as unprecedented. The transmission included 3 lines of data: the object's estimated velocity, its direction, and its rate of course deviation. The numbers made no sense. The deviation rate alone was impossible by any known physical standard. No natural object should be capable of altering direction so fast while traveling at that speed. Meteors don't do that. Comets don't do that. And even the most agile spacecraft built by any nation on Earth couldn't replicate the sudden directional shift the radar had detected. The operators escalated the alert. Protocol demanded it. Within minutes, the signal was forwarded through multiple secure channels, eventually reaching the Air Force Space Surveillance Network. That's when the internal classification began. Files were locked, logs were restricted. Access was granted only to personnel with a level of clearance most people don't even know exists. And yet, despite this massive early movement inside the military, There was zero public information. NASA hadn't issued a briefing. No observatory had released a detection alert. The scientific community was silent not because they were hiding something, but because they genuinely didn't know. NASA simply wasn't informed. Several hours later, when civilian astronomers finally detected the object, the agency scrambled to analyze the data. But their instruments weren't the first to see 3I Atlas. Their telescopes weren't the first to record its signature. And their experts weren't the first to raise concerns. By the time NASA released a carefully worded statement about an unidentified interstellar object, the U.S. Air Force had already logged multiple encounters, radar sweeps, and at least 2 anomalous pilot reports. One of these reports came from a training flight over the Pacific. The pilots, flying at high altitude, intercepted a visual anomaly that they could not explain. Their audio log later described it as a metallic reflection, but one that behaved unlike any known craft. It flickered, vanished, reappeared, and changed position far too quickly to be attributed to turbulence or optical illusions. More importantly, the pilots weren't the only ones who saw it. Their onboard instruments recorded a brief but undeniable signature, a compact, high-energy burst consistent with acceleration, not impact. Something had moved deliberately. Something had changed direction intentionally. And something had responded to their presence. In the hours that followed, Air Force analysts began assembling what they internally referred to as a non-terrestrial trajectory anomaly, but publicly, nothing. Even after NASA issued its report, the Air Force remained silent. The agency acted as if the object barely existed. They withheld their data, their logs, and their analysis. And when journalists requested transparency, the responses were vague, cold, and carefully crafted. But buried inside those restricted logs that were never supposed to leave the military's internal network was something far more disturbing. A note written by an unnamed analyst read, "Object appears controlled. Recommend high confidentiality." That single sentence changed the tone of the entire investigation. What the Air Force knew, what they saw, and how long they had been aware of it painted a very different picture than the one NASA later presented. And it explains why so many critical files related to 3I Atlas were quietly classified within hours of detection. In this episode, we're going to break down the timeline piece by piece. We're going to explore the sensor readings, the pilot accounts, the erased documents, and the contradictions between NASA's public statements and the military's secret actions. Because once you see the full timeline, you'll understand one thing very clearly. The Air Force knew. They knew early, they knew deeply, and they never intended for the public to find out. The leaks, the logs, and the deletions. Before sunrise on the morning of the 3I Atlas detection, something unusual began happening inside the Air Force's secure network. Analysts later described it as a data funnel, a quiet, systematic redirection of information from standard monitoring servers into a classified compartment that didn't appear on the general system map. Most personnel didn't even know such a compartment existed. Only a handful of officers had access, and every login attempt was shadow-tracked and encrypted. But the strangest part wasn't the secrecy, it was the timing. The funneling began 26 minutes after the earliest radar signature of 3I Atlas. That's not enough time for a full analysis, but it is enough time for someone somewhere to recognize that what they were seeing wasn't ordinary. Inside the locked environment, the first document moved was labeled AFRSO3I Event, Preliminary Anomalous Tracking Report, Timestamp 241 ET. This document would later disappear entirely from the Air Force's internal index. But it didn't vanish before 2 technicians saw it and secretly copied parts of it. What they described would become the backbone of everything that leaked later. The report didn't use the name 3I Atlas. Instead, it referred to the object as unclassified interstellar ingress, type reactive, not type natural, not type debris, reactive. In Air Force terminology, Reactive refers to an object that responds to external forces, mechanical, electromagnetic, or intentional. In other words, something that reacts. Something not passive, something possibly controlled. But that wasn't the most alarming detail. The report contained a velocity chart showing micro-adjustments in trajectory over a 300-second window. NASA's public models later described 3IATLAS as moving in a stable hyperbolic path. But the Air Force chart showed slight, repeated changes far too precise and frequent to be caused by natural forces like dust impact or gravitational eddies. Someone or something was adjusting it. These micro-adjustments were so subtle that civilian telescopes wouldn't have noticed them. Even NASA would have missed them during initial tracking because their instruments update in longer intervals. Only military radar networks with near real-time refresh rates could detect such changes, and the Air Force had that data from the very beginning. The technicians who saw the report said they initially believed it might be an error. But 3 hours later, a second document was added to the secure partition, AFSOC Priority Advisory, Potential Non-Ballistic Object. Secure Tag, Redust, O9A Non-Ballistic, another highly unusual classification. A ballistic object follows physics. A non-ballistic object chooses not to. Inside the advisory was a short paragraph from an Air Force physicist whose name was redacted. The note said, "Observed course changes are inconsistent with natural behavior. Potential directed propulsion. Further tracking required." It also recommended a cross-branch coordination with NASA, yet NASA was never informed. Why? Because the advisory was overwritten less than 3 hours later. Not deleted. Overwritten. When someone deletes a file, there's a traceable echo. When someone overwrites it, the system treats it as if it never existed. But the technicians were watching. They saw the deletion happen in real time. They also saw something else. A second overwrite removed the radar graphs of the trajectory changes completely, leaving only the raw timestamps behind unusable without the graphs. This was not routine data maintenance. This was deliberate. Meanwhile, in a secure hangar on a base whose location was redacted in every leaked memo, 2 pilots were being debriefed. These were the same pilots who hours earlier had visually encountered the reflective anomaly near the projected path of 3IATLAS. Their audio logs later leaked contain one of the most unsettling exchanges ever recorded in a cockpit. "It's not drifting. It's pacing us. Nothing paces at Mach." "That's impossible." "Sir, it just jumped. It blinked out and came back farther up." "Keep recording." "Don't lose it." "How do you record something that isn't constant?" Short silence. "Whatever this is, it knows we're here." The key phrase wasn't the mention of pacing or blinking. It was the last line. "It knows we're here." When analysts examined the flight data afterward, they found a single, sharp electromagnetic spike at the exact moment the pilots reported the object jumping. It lasted less than a millisecond. It was too brief to analyze, too strong to be noise, and too structured to be random. It appeared again later in the data at the exact moment the pilots ended their visual with the reflection. This spike was labeled as a directed burst. The classification was so rare that only 3 people in the entire division had the clearance to view it. Those spikes would never appear in NASA's public dataset, not because NASA was hiding them, but because NASA never received them. Inside the Air Force logs, though, those spikes were the smoking gun. They indicated a form of propulsion or communication that didn't match any known system on Earth. One line from a classified comment, written by a senior analyst, became legendary among those who saw it. Trajectory consistency suggests intention. Object may be mapping. The idea that 3I Atlas might not be traveling randomly. That its movements might be part of a larger pattern, not yet understood. But the most chilling detail wasn't the mapping. It wasn't the directed bursts. It wasn't the pilot encounter or the overwritten files. It was what happened next. At 8:16 ET, a third and final classified notice appeared shorter than the others, with only one instruction. Cease interagency dissemination. All future tracking. ONYX tier only. NASA excluded. 3 hours later, NASA made its first public statement about the newly detected interstellar visitor. They had no idea that, by then, the Air Force already had over 6 hours of data, 2 encounters, electromagnetic signatures, and enough evidence to classify 3 IATLAS as a non-ballistic reactive anomaly. NASA wasn't lying. They were simply out of the loop, on purpose. And the question we have to ask is no longer, why didn't NASA speak? It is now, why was NASA kept in the dark? The cover-up, the whistleblower, and the timeline they never wanted released. By the time NASA began publicly discussing 3 IATLAS, a parallel operation had already reached its peak inside the Air Force. Within internal channels, the event was labeled a Tier -3 containment scenario, a classification used only when 3 conditions are met. The object displays non-ballistic behavior. The object interacts with military assets. Public disclosure is considered destabilizing. 3.1 ATLAS met all 3 criteria within its first hours of detection. But the real turning point, the moment the cover-up became irreversible, came when a military orbital platform detected something no one expected, a thermal anomaly. The platform, fitted with infrared sensors used to track missile launches, captured a heat signature emanating from the object. That heat should not have existed. Interstellar objects, especially ones traveling for millions of years through cold space, are frozen, inert, and thermally dead. 3.1 Atlas wasn't. Its heat signature pulsed at regular intervals. 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off. Then a pause. Then the pattern repeated. Pulse patterns are not natural. They're engineered. When analysts attempted to cross-match the pattern with known propulsion systems, communications arrays, or heat dissipation cycles, the result came back the same each time, no terrestrial match. That was the moment the first whistleblower snapped. We still don't know their identity. Only that they exported a series of files disguised as corrupted telemetry and transferred them through a loophole in the Air Force's archival system. The files contained partial radar graphs, fragments of the overwritten advisory, and one short video clip recorded from a classified internal briefing. In the footage, a high-ranking officer stands at the front of a dimly lit room, gesturing toward a projected image of 3 I-Atlas. But the object in the image is not simply a glowing blur. It has edges, angles, structure, a faint geometric outline like the frame of something metallic. Not a rock, not a comet, not an asteroid. Something built. Then, near the end of the video, the officer says a sentence that would become famous among everyone who later saw the leak. NASA will receive a simplified trajectory model. Nothing else. Those 8 words confirmed everything. NASA's data had been filtered, simplified, sanitized, not for scientific clarity, but to conceal the truth. But the leak didn't stop there. A second file contained the full communications transcript between the Air Force and a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft dispatched to make visual contact with 3.1 ATLAS. The aircraft never got close enough to see the object directly. But its electromagnetic sensors detected something extraordinary, a repeating tri-band signal, cycling every 19 seconds. It wasn't random interference. It wasn't solar noise. It wasn't equipment malfunction. The signal had structure-logical breaks, repeating intervals, harmonic consistency. Even without decoding, analysts determined it was non-natural, non-random, non-terrestrial. In the transcript, the lead scientist monitoring the signal says, "The spacing is too clean. This is either communication or a scan." A scan. If 3 I-Atlas was scanning Earth or scanning the craft observing it, then the object wasn't just reactive, it was aware. Meanwhile, NASA, unaware of any of this, continued issuing calm, scientifically neutral public updates. They posted basic orbital projections. They analyzed the object's brightness. They debated whether it resembled an interstellar comet or a fragment of a rogue planetary core, all while the Air Force privately analyzed signals, heat pulses, radar spikes, pilot encounters, and geometry the public never saw. Then came the most telling detail in the leaked files, a timeline. A full hour-by-hour reconstruction of everything the Air Force knew and when they knew it. It showed the first radar detection hours before NASA even opened a tracking ticket. The first micro-adjustments measured long before civilian astronomers noticed the anomaly. The electromagnetic spikes detected during the pilot encounter. The infrared pulses confirmed by orbital sensors. The tri-band signal cycles recorded by reconnaissance aircraft. The overriding of two major reports. The order to block NASA from receiving sensitive telemetry and the creation of ONYX tier classification. At the bottom of the timeline was a final note: public disclosure not recommended, object behavior unknown. Potential intelligence implications. Intelligence implications. The kind of phrase used only when dealing with technology, not rocks. When that leak quietly spread through private circles, experts noticed something else. The timeline ended abruptly, even though the object continued approaching Earth for days afterward. It simply cut off mid-sentence, mid-analysis, mid-classification. Someone wanted the final phase hidden. And that raised the final question: what happened in those last days? Why did the Air Force stop updating the internal timeline? Why did the leaks end before the object made its closest approach? The answer came from a final anonymous message dropped weeks later, just one sentence long. The last data point was not an anomaly. It was a response. A response. To what we don't know, to who we can only speculate. But one thing is certain: 3-1 Atlas didn't just pass through our system. It interacted with sensors, with aircraft, with observers. Maybe even with signals we didn't know we were sending. NASA never saw the real data. The public never heard the full story. The Air Force kept their secret locked behind layers of classification and misinformation. But thanks to the leaks, the missing files, the overwritten documents, and the pilots who refused to stay silent, we can now reconstruct the truth. The Air Force knew about 3I Atlas long before NASA. They studied it. They hid it. And they still aren't telling the world what it really was. And until they do, this remains the most unexplained, most concealed, and most potentially important interstellar encounter in recorded history. The story isn't finished. It's only beginning.